Story 1. I called 911 in the United Kingdom when I was drunk to make the point that it was the wrong number. Our emergency number is 999, and calls to 911 are redirected to it. Story 2. 911 dispatcher here. Some of the most absurd reasons people call are to ask about the weather, internet outages, and so on. You would not believe how many people call 911 just to have a conversation and tell the dispatcher what is going on in their lives. Story 3. My brother called the police when he was 5 to say hello. No one at home knew he had done it, and he could not explain why he called, so they sent a unit to the house. He was over the moon, and my mother was livid. Story 4. One of my friends called 911 to report it after she found out her boyfriend had cheated on her. Sometimes people just don't know what to do after being cheated on. Laughing out loud. Story 5. I saw a video of a recorded call in which a woman got into her car without her keys and locked the door. Not knowing how cars work or bothering to check first, she called 911 and cried that she had locked herself inside her car. The operator was very polite and patient, calmed the woman down, and after a few confused questions asked her to try pulling on the handle. The operator's quiet exasperation was quickly drowned out by the caller's embarrassment when the door opened. You can hear in her voice how foolish she feels. I will see if I can find the video and add it later. It is worth listening to. Story 6. I once called the police because I thought someone was beating their dog and shoving it into a trash can, then walking away as if it were nothing. It turned out to be a novelty giant teddy bear, and they were trying to make it fit in the trash can. Story 7. I have had patients call 911 because they are not allowed to eat for testing or procedures. Story 8. I know a child who prank called 911 5 times to order a pizza. The police went to her house to speak with her parents, and I was laughing out loud. Story 9. Was there not a news story in which a woman called because a fast food restaurant was out of chicken nuggets? Story 10. I was out with 2 other guys. We were shoveling snow at different houses. Toward the end, we took turns so one person could go outside to shovel while the other 2 warmed up and ate or drank something. At one house, the only black member of our group went out to shovel. When he finished and started back toward the truck, police cars arrived as he reached us. It turned out the occupants of the house we had parked in front of had called, reporting someone suspicious in the neighborhood. We got out and explained the situation. The officers understood and left. With the job done, we left as well. It was ridiculous. Story 11. The cop who ate a pot brownie and then called 911 on himself. I think I'm dead. Story 12. I was removing a man for getting belligerent. He was knocking items off tables and screaming at employees. I walked up, started to put on my gloves, and told him he had until I finished to start walking to the door or I would physically escort him out. It was mostly just a hand on his shoulder as we walked, just enough to keep him moving. He called 911 and told them I was raping him. He wanted me arrested for sexual assault in public. It was the only time I have seen a 911 dispatcher hang up on someone. Story 13. My stepdad called emergency services when a raccoon got into our house. The operator advised him to open a door and wait for it to leave. Story 14. My favorite of all time was the police officer who called 911 because he and his girlfriend used drugs he had stolen from a suspect, became too high, and began to fear they were dying. Story 15. Years ago, I knew a man who called 911 because he was out of beer and too drunk to drive to the store for more. He received a visit from the police. Story 16. My daughter called once because her homework had to be done in cursive. Story 17. There was a squirrel in the road. It was alive, just playing. A driver did not want to run it over and stopped, so the squirrel did not move. They called 911 so the police could get the squirrel into a tree. I lived in a small town with a hilarious police blotter of all the dumbest 911 calls made by the town's fancy residents. Another time someone reported seeing a real witch walking around. It was a girl dressed in black with a cape, and the caller was convinced she was a witch coming to curse the town. There were many others, but I forget them now. Story 18. When I was 14, I worked at an old-fashioned soda fountain, sandwich shop, and pharmacy. One day, a woman came in for a malt and an egg salad sandwich. She was a 911 dispatcher and told me about a woman who called every day to ask what day it was, what time it was, and what the weather was. I told her to give the woman our number. Mary, nicknamed Meme, called us every day, sometimes a couple of times. The dispatcher asked me to call her if Meme ever skipped a day, and we didn't hear from her. One day it hit me. I was 17. A whole shift went by without a call from Meme. I called the dispatcher. We all went to Meme's funeral. Her elderly sister showed me the note she had stuck to the wall by the phone. It read, "My name, Tate Drugstore. The number. Call every day, it's okay." I lost my shit. Sorry. This question reminded me of that. I am 41 now. I still wonder about the regulars. Did she ever finish beauty school? Was that really Alan Jackson's baby? Did he ever lose enough weight to buy a Harley? Was the blind man really blind? Or did he just like me reading his mail out loud? Did the pharmacist, John Jordan, know how poor my family was, and is that why he offered me the job and had his wife buy me pants and shoes? It's weird what sticks in your mind and what doesn't. Story 19. I remember reading recently that someone called 911 at a drive-thru because they had a problem with their order and the restaurant was not doing anything about it. Story 20. I knew someone who called 911 because he thought his houseplants were conspiring to murder him. Story 21. My dad called 911 to report that I was taking back the things he stole from me. The audio is already on YouTube. My sister released it to prove that I was the bad guy. It did not go the way they imagined. Story 22. I called the non-emergency line because my Amazon package had been thrown into someone's gated property. I had just moved to town and didn't want a trespassing charge for hopping the gate. I couldn't stop laughing while explaining to the dispatcher because it felt so silly. I apologized profusely to the police officer who responded. He said it was probably a good idea and climbed the fence to retrieve it for me. I felt bad. He was a nice guy. Story 23. Not dumb but more like cute. My sister, a school therapist who also taught some classes, used to teach children how to dial 911, what to say, and when to call. The children went home that night and practiced, although not many of them did. The next day, she received a visit from a very nice police officer at the school. She decided to let the local police and the 911 call center know ahead of time when she planned to teach that lesson the following year. She continued to teach the lesson for many years but always gave them a heads up. Some of the dispatchers had a nice discussion with the children. Story 24. Caller reports needing cigarettes. Caller reports being trapped in their car. They are not intoxicated and did not realize the doors had been locked. Caller reports a house key stuck in a lock. The caller is intoxicated and it is not their house. Caller reports wind causing a tree branch to tap their window. The caller is sober, an older adult, and annoyed, and requests that the fire department be notified to trim the tree. Caller reports a car stolen from a hotel parking lot. The caller is sober. They flew into town and took a taxi from the airport to the hotel. Multiple callers request condoms. Some callers are sober while others are intoxicated. Story 25. A child called one night while I was at work. He was asking for popcorn. Story 26. In my town, a group of people reported seeing a ghost and contacted the police for assistance, but no ghost was found. Story 27. My husband is an officer. One of my favorite stories he told me was about a phone call from a perfectly able-bodied young adult who did not want to wait for the city bus and was requesting a ride to her friend's house. Story 28. With one major cable provider in my province, the channel number for one of the sports channels is 911. An elderly man accidentally dialed 911 when he confused his television remote for his phone while trying to watch the Canucks game. Story 29. My ex-partner is a paramedic. He was once called at 3 in the morning because someone could not feel their legs. After he put the patient in the ambulance, he discovered the person had fallen asleep on the commode and their legs had gone numb from sitting there too long. Story 30. Technically, I called the emergency line here in the United Kingdom once for a leaking pipe in the bathroom. The leak affected the phone line. We still had a landline until about a month ago, when they stopped providing them, and it somehow called the emergency services. The first we knew was when the police turned up to check all was okay. By that time, the phone line had been disconnected. It was good to see they did turn up. I apologized profusely, told the police all was okay, and they left it at that. I was just glad they believed me. It is also reassuring that they will respond even when they are 99% sure it is a line fault. That 1% could mean the difference between life and death for someone sometime. Story 31. A woman under house arrest called 911 to order cigarettes. She could not leave because she was wearing an ankle monitor and was experiencing withdrawal. She considered it an emergency to get cigarettes. Story 32. I am calling to report people giving out Halloween candy that contains peanuts. Story 33. Among the reasons I have personally encountered: 1. To discipline their children. It is past their bedtime and the children are not behaving, but the parents do not want to become too angry. They call the police to scare the children into going to bed while the parents save face. 2. An elderly woman activated her fall detection alarm. The alarm center attempted to contact her, could not reach her, and then called for an ambulance. Paramedics arrived to find her having tea with a friend. She said that she had told them they would show up. 3. As a taxi service in Canada. In Ontario, a person is charged for an ambulance only if the patient is transported and the service is provided by the hospital. I have seen many cases of people who lived near the hospital and had been drinking. They say they want to go to the hospital because they are too intoxicated, receive a ride, then say the wait is too long and decline to register, which means they cannot be billed for the ride. Then they say they live around the corner and feel better, so they walk home. It is cheaper than a taxi or an Uber. 4. To retrieve an item or food. This could be bringing pizza or Uber Eats from the front door, grabbing a television remote, getting a vodka bottle, buttering a bun, or making coffee. Often this involves people who are so obese that they cannot walk or people who are extremely intoxicated. Occasionally, it is an extremely elderly person who should not be home alone and is on a waiting list, but that is less common. 5. Because someone appears to need help but no one wants to check on them. The number of times someone calls saying they think a person has died but they are too afraid or unwilling to check is astounding. Sometimes the same homeless person sleeping in a park gets 10 calls in a day and no one is willing to look. This is a complete waste of resources. Sometimes the person is awake and simply looks sad while sitting in a park, and someone calls because they believe the person needs mental health support. An example: a man accidentally swallowed some of his own semen, and he was worried it caused an upset stomach. The dispatch operator reassured him that people have swallowed semen for generations. Story 34. 911 operators should not disconnect calls about pizza, food delivery, or other non-emergency requests because the caller might be secretly asking for help. Story 35. I was 8 or 9 and at my grandparents' house. They had one of those VTech cell phones. I got bored and wanted to test the phone, so I dialed 911 but added a bunch of random numbers at the end because there was no way it would call 911, right? It did. Instead of explaining that it was a mistake, I got scared and hid the phone under the couch while the dispatcher was on the line. I promptly forgot about it. However, as my parents drove me home, we saw police cars going the opposite direction. Later that day, I accidentally called 911 again. I had picked up my aunt's iPhone and entered the wrong passcode too many times, which brought up the emergency call screen. So any tap would call the police. My parents were not happy. They were even more angry after my grandpa called and told them the police had come to his house. Story 36. I am a former dispatcher. I took a call from a woman asking that the county move the deer crossing sign near her property. I asked if the sign was damaged or if there was another reason she wanted it moved. She said it was dangerous to drive with all the deer crossing the street and asked if we could move the sign down a mile or so the deer would cross there. I said I would make a note for the county but doubted they would move the sign. The level of misunderstanding was shocking. Story 37. A colleague from information technology once accidentally called 911 at work. I was in my cubicle when I suddenly heard Carl apologizing and thought I heard a police radio. I peeked around the corner and, sure enough, 2 police officers were talking with him. Our manager came out of his office laughing and shaking his head, while everyone, including the police officers, had a good laugh at Carl's expense. It turned out Carl had been working on a 911 report at our telecommunications company and meant to call the person who wrote it. He lost focus and started dialing 911 instead of the person's extension. The moment he hit the second one, he realized what he had done and hung up, thinking the call had not gone through. But with 911, there is no delay. As soon as you dial it, the call is live. My mother, a retired dispatcher, confirmed that. The dispatcher treated it as a hang-up and sent officers to check it out. Carl had a friendly meeting with Human Resources and picked up the nickname Captain 911. Story 38. I had a small party in my backyard. No music, just 10 or so people hanging out. The police showed up and asked why we were trying to kill the neighbor's dog. Huh? Apparently one of our guests threw a single chicken bone over the fence into the neighbor's yard. Rude and uncalled. Yes, but the neighbor called and said we were trying to assassinate his dog. I went over to apologize and retrieve the bone, but the neighbor just stared at me through the window. The police knew him well and simply asked us to avoid interacting or planning any such actions. Story 39. My friend had a bad high and was convinced ghosts would come and get her, so she was texting everyone in a panic. I arrived as she was on the phone with the emergency number 999 and explained to the dispatcher that a sober adult was with her. Her pulse and breathing were normal, and I was going to make her eat some toast. The dispatcher gave me a few signs to watch for and said to call again if we needed to. She was very helpful. Story 40. Someone once called because their sandwich did not have enough cheese. Humanity truly peaked that day. Story 41. When they do not get what they want from a fast food restaurant, Karen is about to be trespassed and she does not even know it. Story 42. A story from a few years ago about a woman who called 911 because McDonald's could not fulfill her Chicken McNuggets order. They had run out. Story 43. I was on a flight a couple of years ago when the aircraft had to go around because of low visibility and snow. It was a bit bumpy, but we returned and landed on the second attempt. An elderly woman a few rows ahead of me took out her mobile phone and called the local emergency number, 112, to warn them that the plane was about to crash. Flight attendants noticed the phone and were not amused. Story 44. You will have psychiatric patients calling law enforcement because they believe law enforcement can get them out of the psychiatric hospital. This only prompts law enforcement to call us back to ensure the patient does not continue calling. Story 45. I work security at a college. We used a 911 scanner to know when emergency units were coming to campus, since the local dispatch center is not great at notifying us when something was going on. One night, I heard a call for someone who had smoked so much marijuana they could not open their eyes and lost consciousness for 5 minutes. Story 46. A person whom I had told to stay off my property came to my home and knocked on my door. I answered and placed a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun against his head. I told him he had 30 seconds to leave my land. He left and then called the police. When the police arrived, I showed them the video, and they arrested him for trespassing. He was angry that they did not arrest me. Story 47. When I was a small child, I called 911 to ask the operator how their day was. It was very foolish, and I got into a lot of trouble afterward. Story 48. I once had a man call us, emergency medical services, because he had terrible stomach pain and couldn't breathe. About a mile down the road, he asked us to stop and let him out. He was having a one-night stand and wanted to get out of it. An expensive way to ghost someone. Story 49. When I was 16, I climbed to the top of a mountain in the middle of the night, mostly because I was manic and depressed and did not want to go home. It was absolutely freezing and windy. I thought I was going to get hypothermia, so I called the police to come get me. I got a free ride in a police car, which was kind of cool. Story 50. I called 911 for a silly reason when I was in elementary school or preschool. I do not remember my exact age, but my mom told me this story and I only vaguely remember it. I was watching the movie Titanic and thought it was happening in real time, so I told the operator the ship was sinking. My mom found me, apologized to the operator, and I got in trouble. Story 51. They did a news story on the most absurd calls to the emergency number 999 in the United Kingdom this year, and I still remember one caller who rang because there was a hedgehog in her garden and she was afraid of it. There is always someone calling because they were shortchanged or were handed an ice cream without sprinkles. Story 52. My husband is a firefighter. Early in his career, he was called to a frequent caller named Lois. She was a woman in her 70s who would regularly tie herself to her bed, spread-eagled and naked, and call for help. Story 53. 1. A woman called to complain that a homeless person asking for money was not grateful after she gave him money and wanted the police to talk to him about being thankful. 2. A man called to report that his neighbor was cutting down a tree in the neighbor's yard. The caller liked the tree and wanted the police to stop him, even though the neighbor was cutting it down on his own property. 3. A woman claimed that someone broke into her home and left her a new cat, which turned out to be a ball of yarn. 4. There were many ridiculous complaints about people not wearing masks. My favorite was a man who complained that a woman and her child were not wearing masks on a nature trail. He said he had coronavirus disease 2019 and that they needed masks because he did not want to wear one. I asked why he was out in public with coronavirus disease 2019 and not wearing a mask. He hung up. Story 54. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents called emergency services last week to report that someone was trying to climb, open, or ram the entrance to their detention center. When local police department officers arrived, there were only 2 American Broadcasting Company reporters setting up a camera on the sidewalk. No one touched the doors. The Broadview police chief says that immigration and customs enforcement agents made false emergency calls. I have heard recordings of people calling emergency services to report that a McDonald's employee told them the ice cream machine was broken and they really wanted an ice cream cone. Story 55. Their electricity went out, and they wanted the police to fix it. Story 56. Common complaints about fast food orders include a messed-up burger, not enough shrimp in the order, and a restaurant that is not even open yet. Story 57. I was dropping off a patient at the hospital, and as we were leaving, we were dispatched to another call. The patient was pale, unresponsive, and not breathing in a wheelchair outside. The call was a considerable distance away. We turned on the emergency lights and siren and drove quickly. We received updates that the caller refused to get any closer and would not check for a pulse. I arrived on scene as a flycar medic was rolling up behind me. My partner and I grabbed all of our equipment and went to the patient. It was a mannequin sitting in a wheelchair next to someone's house. Story 58. A woman asked me to send officers to look for her dog that she had let out into her fenced yard because it was taking longer than usual, and she had already taken off her glasses for the night. A man demanded that we arrest the Schwann's truck driver for knocking on his door. A man was upset that his neighbor was flying the American flag upside down. A man requested help carrying a propane tank. During that call, officers found a methamphetamine laboratory. Story 59. An Airbnb host tried to charge me an extra fee because I booked for one person and brought a guest. I refused. They called the police, who did nothing. Story 60. A customer called 911 on me when I worked at a video store because I would not give her cash back. Only store credit. On a digital versatile disc she was returning. She yelled at me nonstop until the police arrived, and they arrested her. She apparently had a habit of calling them for no reason. It was possibly the greatest moment of my 10-year career as a video store clerk. Story 61. Hotel front desk worker here. A guest once called the police, alleging I, a white woman, was racially discriminating against her because I would not take her room service order at midnight. We provide room service only from 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening. Story 62. I used to work in an emergency room in a non-medical role and saw this happen firsthand. Nursing staff notified us that a rescue was bringing in a patient with chest pain. My coworker prepared to get patient information from the ambulance crew, so I stood outside by the pedestrian door to watch them come in. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later and backed in for drop-off. The patient walked out with rolling luggage. I had a clear view and thought the person did not have chest pain. As they walked, I could hear them arguing with the ambulance crew. A couple of minutes later, my coworker came out of the emergency room and said the person did not want to be seen. I thought that was good. Immediately after, the person walked out of the emergency room and headed toward the waiting room. I stood next to the security guard and watched the person pick up the phone on the wall and call a number. Then I saw the same ambulance crew that had just dropped the person off, who had not even left yet, walk out of the emergency room, go straight to the waiting room, and start yelling that 911 is not an Uber. The person apparently thought that if they called 911 again, they would be transported from my hospital to another one. The person then stormed out through the pedestrian door and walked away with rolling luggage. I have seen some wild things in that emergency room, but that was the dumbest thing I have seen. Story 63, paramedic here. My favorite is when someone says, "Will you turn up my thermostat? It's too cold to get up from the couch." Story 64. Criminals in San Diego sometimes try to call Mexico using the country code 011, but instead they call 911 by mistake. Story 65. People who call the police on themselves after committing crimes. Story 66. I knew police officers in Baltimore who carried a small pellet pistol in their car. People would call 911 because of a rat in their home. That was many years ago. Story 67. My favorite is the woman who called 911 to ask the police officers who had just left her home to come back, because she thought one of them was cute and wanted to meet him again. Story 68. From the police log in my tiny hometown. Someone called to report that another person had planted grass seed in their yard while they were away. On another occasion, someone called because a man had kicked a school bus tire. It was unclear whether the call was to report an injury he had probably sustained or to resolve whatever escalating argument had led him to kick the bus. Story 69. My old roommates got too baked and called the fire department because they thought the low battery beeping of the carbon monoxide detector was the signal for an actual carbon monoxide emergency. The firefighters arrived with a fire engine, smelled what was happening, told them to replace the detector batteries, and left. I was not with them because I had an exam the next day and was studying at the library. Story 70. I always think of the off-duty police officer in 2007 who called 911 after baking and eating marijuana brownies with his wife. They thought they were really dying. Story 71. When I was little, I called 911 because I thought they would have my grandmother's phone number so I could call her to say happy birthday. Story 72. My ex would not return my rabbit. He called the police on me for a welfare check. I was at home and had texted him politely asking when I could pick up my rabbit or when he could bring her. The police told him to return her and stop harassing me. Story 73. I am a retired dispatcher. A man called multiple times because he could not maintain an erection. He could not because he had been using methamphetamine all night. After 4 or 5 calls and as many warnings, I sent officers to address the misuse. He was arrested for possession of methamphetamine and misuse of the emergency number 911. Story 74. We recently had 11 police cars arrive at our house because of a report of a gun. We are in Australia, so this was a big deal. It turned out someone driving by saw the bright green Nerf gun my son was playing with and believed it was real. Story 75. I called 911 because I heard a prowler trying to get in my second-story window. Police officers arrived, shone a spotlight up there, and it was my cat, which I had accidentally locked out. Story 76. I was a young child, probably 4 or 5, and my father worked at the fire department. I missed him and decided to call 911 to talk to him. My mother was angry. Story 77. A frog jumped onto his windshield after he was already in the car. Story 78. The dumbest reason I can remember is approaching an ambulance because of an itchy scrotum. Story 79. A colleague was late for work because he called the police after a seagull in his back garden distracted him. It was utterly absurd. Story 80. In 2001, I called to make sure the number worked while I was at home. I was very young. Story 81. I read a news story about a police officer who stole special brownies from work and brought them home to his wife. Neither of them had ever tried cannabis before, and instead of taking a small bite to see what would happen, they each ate several brownies. They started panicking, and the police officer called 911 for help. Story 82. When I was 8, our vegan neighbor called the police because we were having a barbecue. Not even kidding. Story 83. When I started training as an emergency call handler, My first call was from a woman who called the emergency number 999 to report that her 7-year-old son had been shaking pears from a pear tree. The owner of the tree had come outside and forced the child to eat all the pears that had fallen. Even my mentor did not know what to say. The only question I could think of was how many pears he had actually eaten. She sounded surprised that I asked. He had eaten 2 or 3 before she intervened and called the police. Story 84. I saw a man break into a car and I took a video of it. I called 911 and they told me to call 311. The police department did not give a fuck. Story 85. I am a former dispatcher. I once received a call reporting squirrels in a woman's attic. Animal control did not respond, so she called the police. She repeatedly insisted that the police department come and handle it. I sent a sergeant to her house to explain that the police do not have any squirrel catching equipment among their issued gear. Story 86. A friend of mine is a 911 operator, and the most ridiculous call she ever received was from a man who said ketchup was missing from the bag of food he had ordered at a Burger King drive-thru. Story 87. I don't know if anyone remembers, but when YouTube went down once, people were calling 911 to complain, which was funny. Story 88. Advanced Life Support Emergency Medical Services Field Provider for a Municipality. Here is a list of chief complaints. I have a yeast infection and the clinic is not open until morning. I think I might have a bug in my ear from last night, but I am not sure. I have had this rash for a month and do not know what to do. My doctor called and said my labs were abnormal and to schedule a checkup. I have an appointment at the hospital clinic and the taxi I scheduled did not come. I have an appointment today at a distant hospital. I did not want to pay for the taxi there. Please take me to the distant hospital for my appointment. My father was discharged from alcohol rehabilitation today and he somehow came home intoxicated. She just broke up with her boyfriend and is hyperventilating. Your patient is a naked male on a bicycle. We do not know what is wrong with him. He is just riding a bicycle naked and someone called it in. He just waved at them, if that matters. My child's finger is stuck in the top of a container of wet wipes. I used to get angry about these calls. Sometimes I was amused, but often angry. I was especially angry when, while we were transporting the patient with the yeast infection, there was a major motor vehicle accident on the highway with entrapment and we could not respond as the closest unit because we already had a patient using us as a taxi to the hospital. At some point, I got over it. I stopped making fun of people or getting angry about why they called. 911 is what it is. No one calls 911 for any reason when they are having a good day. People call 911 on their subjective worst days. 911 is a backstop, a last chance for people on their worst days to hopefully get course corrected and saved when they are worried and everything else is going wrong. 911 is the opposite of natural selection, stopping some of the weakest from dying. Operating a 911 system is an act of mercy and love by a society. Instead of getting angry or cynical, in my last year working as a first responder, I decided to give people a little grace. I worked in fire service, emergency medical services, hazardous materials, and technical rescue. I realized it is a complete social and economic system failure when someone with a yeast infection does not know what to do and has to call 911 as the solution. Where were her parents or family to teach her when she was younger? Where was her access to health care? Where was her access to a regular pharmacy? Why was the only fix to her problem to call 911? The woman who called because her cab did not show for her appointment. Later I realized it is because we have a poor system to get less mobile, disadvantaged patients to the appointments they legitimately need to keep them healthy. We need to remove barriers to care, not rely on ambulances to figure it out. When those patients do not see the doctor, they get sicker. As an emergency medical services provider, I then get them as legitimate 911 patients who could die without intervention. When they call, I am intubating for severe respiratory distress due to congestive heart failure and applying pre-hospital continuous positive airway pressure and other interventions. But it did not have to be that way. I got to use my skills, but we as a healthcare system and as a country should have done much better by this person. That patient is probably costing the system and the country 100 times what it should have if she had just seen her doctor originally and had her care monitored and adjusted. At the end I realized you call, I haul. Move on to the next one. While I could make light forever of the funny 911 calls, I hate talking about the traumatic ones. Murdered infants working cardiopulmonary resuscitation under a Christmas tree, and other scenes that haunt you. Through odd circumstances of fate, despite hundreds of miles of distance, I had a patient who fatally overdosed who I used to play with as a child. Save what you can. Accept what you cannot. Leave it at the end of the day. Story 89. 911 operator here. Order pizza. These pranks really piss me off. Story 90. I am a 911 dispatcher. I received a call because a man had a mosquito in his eye. I also received a call from another man who requested an ambulance for his father because the father could not stop calling him. Story 91. In second grade, I called 911 because someone in my class hit me, and I called again because my cat was on the roof and I thought she was stuck. She was not. She just did not want to hang out with me. Story 92. I knew a man who, when he was 2 or 3 years old, called 911 after his mother told him to clean his room because he had been told to call only in an emergency. Story 93. I was struggling to get home in the March snow. No, that's not dumb. In elementary school, I pushed the red button in an elevator. Story 94. Lack of emotional regulation and conflict resolution skills when confronted with an incorrect order or a misunderstanding at the Burger King drive-thru. Story 95. 5-year-old me had just been taught to call 911 when something bad happened. I called 911 because my best friend walked home and I was upset. She lived 3 houses down from us. Story 96. It was a mosquito bite. After I told him that, he shrugged and said he thought so but wanted a medical consultation to be sure. He gave me a granola bar to cheer me up because he said I looked upset. Story 97. I saw a video here in the United Kingdom of a recorded call to the emergency number 999. An elderly man called because there was a rotting chicken in his fridge. He was afraid to put it in the bin because of putrid juices, rats, and germs, so he wanted the police to arrive in a police car and take it away. He even offered to pay for petrol. Story 98. I have heard of people calling the police because of unidentified flying object sightings. I never understood why. It is not the sort of thing they usually spend time on or can do much about. However, there was an interesting incident during an unidentified flying object wave in New Jersey when local police tried to use a drone to follow one of the unidentified flying objects out to sea, but it went too far out to continue tracking. Story 99. This man. Story 100. I heard one once where a woman at McDonald's called because they wouldn't give her fries. I think she may have been inebriated at the time. Story 101. A patient in inpatient stroke rehabilitation called emergency services to have his back scratched. He hung up quickly and was surprised when police officers walked into his room. Story 102. Toe pain turned out to be an ingrown nail, not an infected one. Story 103. A United States citizen traveling abroad may not realize that emergency numbers differ in other countries. Story 104. This was not a 911 call. Someone called an ambulance because their child developed a heat rash. Story 105. A woman called 911 at a restaurant I frequent because her tuna melt contained fish. She was appalled and said she orders tuna melts all the time and they are not fish. The police did not come. My best guess is she confused a tuna melt with a patty melt. Story 106. When I was a kid, maybe 5, my dad was burning leaves in the backyard. My brother, who was the same age, did not realize that was okay and called 911, saying the house was on fire. Firefighters arrived. Story 107. When I was a small child, my puppy got his head stuck under the garden gate. My mother and the neighbors were trying to get him out. She asked me to call my dad. Instead, I called the emergency number 999. Thankfully, the operator was very kind to me. Story 108. This one takes the cake for me. Story 109. People constantly call, thinking the police department is a taxi service. Story 110. When Instagram was down, teenagers called the police here. That was pretty low. Story 111. I once heard the police were dispatched to a home because a caller had dialed 911 to complain about being warned to stop abusing the emergency line with frivolous calls. Story 112. I am an emergency medical technician. Once, someone called because their heart was beating rapidly after a run. It returned to normal when they finished. Story 113. I was 8 years old when my family was moving into a new house. The moving truck ended up blocking the street for a short time, and an elderly woman called the police. The issues were, the truck blocked the street for approximately 5 minutes. The woman did not speak to us or the movers. She was not in a car. She was watching from her living room. It was a narrow one-way street with sets of row houses. Each set had its own parking lot behind it with access on both sides, so drivers could enter a lot at one end, drive behind the houses, and return to the street at the other end to avoid the truck. In other words, we were not actually blocking anyone. Story 114. I know someone who called 911 because he twisted his ankle. Story 115. When I worked in a psychiatric ward, patients would call 911 to report all sorts of false things. Sometimes it was just for entertainment, and sometimes they hoped they would be released. One day, a patient called repeatedly. After the first call, the patient was banned from the phone for the day, but they persuaded other patients to give them the phone. The police had to keep responding because the patient reported being held hostage, not being fed, and being abused. None of these things were true. They were on a 72-hour hold, but we were not harming them. Story 116. There have been numerous occasions when people called 911 on police officers because they were being arrested. Story 117. I am a paramedic. An elderly woman called because a car drove by and the headlights woke her up and she could not go back to sleep. I have also responded to someone with a toothache. They said we were taking too long and walked the block to the hospital. We had to get out of bed, dress, and get into the ambulance. At night, we have 2 minutes to dress and be en route. We are stationed 1.5 miles from the hospital. Story 118. I ordered a pizza and called 911 to complain that it was never delivered. Story 119. I used to listen to the scanner when you still could. It happened several times that a mother wanted a police officer to come over and yell at or scare her child. For example, a daughter came home with a detention from school. A girl refused to wear her bicycle helmet for a ride, and a boy refused to get into the water for his swimming lesson because the water was too cold. There was also a man eating fried chicken from the grocery store in the automated teller machine lobby of a bank at about 10 at night, and someone called the police. The police responded and reported that no crime was being committed. Story 120. When I was 8 years old, I was doing my homework at the coffee table and saw the house phone sitting there. I thought, I wonder what would happen if I dialed 911 and hung up, laughing out loud. For hours later, a couple of police officers showed up at our door while we were playing hide and seek. My mom spun around and glared at me with a fury I had never seen before. I was an idiot. Story 121. My 7-year-old nephew called to report that his house was on fire and his wife was inside. He is on the autism spectrum and was scripting, repeating memorized phrases. The 911 operator could hear my sister snoring loudly in the background and asked who was asleep. He delightedly announced that his mama was asleep. I imagine what the operator must have thought. Hearing a childish voice report that his wife was in a fire while my sister snored. Oblivious. They sent someone to check, but by then he had woken my sister and she told the operator what had happened. Story 122. I knew someone who called 911 because his t-shirt was missing and he thought someone had stolen it. He was also a hoarder. The police showed up and filed a report. Story 123. My mom worked in the call center for Yellowstone National Park for about a year. She handled calls about a stuck elevator that was just slow and opened while they were talking, a sick elk lying on the ground with twitching ears, a loose golden retriever apparently chasing a bison that turned out to be a calf following its mother, and a woman panicking because there were no streetlights and she had never experienced complete darkness. Fun times. Story 124. I called once because my next-door neighbors were at it again. This time I looked outside and he had her in a chokehold, dragging her into the apartment. Story 125. People who call 911 while in the hospital are usually disappointed with the results. A woman called 911 because she wanted to report a doctor who refused to give her intravenous pain medication. An elderly woman called because she wanted a Coke and we were only offering water. An older man called saying we had kidnapped him. A psychiatric patient called saying we were blasting inaudible waves through him. A woman in her 20s called requesting emergency medical services transport to a different emergency room because ours was busy. She arrived via emergency medical services for a clearly non-emergent complaint and was angry when she was sent to the waiting room instead of an emergency room bed. Story 126. I knew someone who was banned from the ambulance service because they kept calling, claiming an ailment, and trying to get the paramedics to drive them home. They were only intoxicated and did not want to pay for a taxi. Story 127. I had a neighbor who called because his pizza delivery was late. Story 128. My neighbor saw me hosing down my paintball equipment one fine Saturday afternoon. The officer did not even bother to get out of his car before reprimanding my neighbor for wasting resources. That was the highlight of my interactions with the police. Since then, they have not acted on an assault and battery in a church parking lot during which I was subjected to slurs, the theft of my compound bow which would have penetrated Kevlar, a theft for which the police know the perpetrator, or my car being totaled as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Story 129. Someone called 911 because McDonald's ran out of nuggets. True patriot. Story 130. There was a bear in my yard, and I called animal control to ask what I should do. I am in a city. They told me to call 911. I felt foolish explaining to the dispatcher why I was calling, and even worse when the police arrived and said they were not going to do anything because the bear was just walking around the neighborhood. My husband still teases me about when I called the police on a bear. Story 131. Two friends were walking home from the bar. One became tired and lay down for a nap. The other kept walking and did not notice. The friend who napped eventually returned, but the other had become lost and called to ask to be picked up and taken home. They kindly came and took him home. Story 132. I work in the emergency department. People have called 911 and been brought to us for a sexually transmitted disease check, staple removal, and treatment for stub toes. Story 133. My favorite call is, I think we're dying, I think we're dead. Story 134. My little brother called 911 when he was about 4 because I was picking on him. I had no idea, and neither did my parents. A while later, when we were outside, a police car arrived. My brother saw it and guiltily ran around to the back of the house. The police officer told my parents that someone had called, and when the dispatcher answered, all they could hear was breathing before the call disconnected. They quickly realized who the culprit was. Once my parents coaxed my brother out of hiding, the officer politely explained that 911 was for emergencies and not to call it unless there was a real emergency. We still like to tease him about it 25 years later. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.